different kinds of loans, for example. And all of these diversifying investments are meant to create incremental returns for our retirement participants over the returns that they would get if they only had fixed income investments. So while I may be skeptical about the theory of secular stagnation, knowing that low interest rates may be with us for a variety of reasons for some time, it's important for us to have a well-diversified portfolio that has some opportunities for higher return, as well as the fixed income investments that are normally associated with the retirement activity.
Now, what you're saying ties into some themes of my course in financial markets about diversification in particular.
Absolutely.
And there is a mathematics of diversification. Now, you have a PhD in economics.
That is true, but I'm not an esteemed economist like you. I am a person with a PhD in economics.
Yeah.
That's true.
So what you are doing at TIA, which I think I applaud, is generating opportunity for real and important diversification.
That is absolutely right. And what I like about it is this is true not just for the senior faculty at a great place like Yale, et cetera, but also for the buildings and grounds people, and we make the same alternative investment diversified portfolio available to everybody. So one of the things I really like about what we do here is we are serving millions of people, some at the very upper end of the university hierarchy, and frankly some who are doing more menial manual kinds of labor. But we give them both access to, directly or indirectly, to this well-diversified portfolio, which we think is part of the secret of getting people safely to and through retirement.
I have one final question, which is, recently it's in the news that you've joined the board of directors of Alphabet, which is the parent of Google.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about what you think Google is an amazing company.
Yes, it is.
And you're not a computer person.
Right.
But I can imagine that you have important contributions. Maybe you could talk about that.
I certainly hope I have important contributions. I think it's going to be a two-way street. So here in my company, we're very interested in digitization and using technology to help people to customize their retirements, et cetera. So I'm very excited about being exposed to Silicon Valley and that kind of thinking and bringing some of that back to TIAA.
Oh, I see your motivation is,
right. So
you have a social motivation. You're thinking
I have a social motive, absolutely.
Of synergies.
I'm looking for synergies now, but it's got to be mutual. So what I think I bring to them is a worldview that's quite different from theirs. So people in Silicon Valley are deep experts on technology. They're deep experts in thinking about how to change what we do. They call it disruptors. That's all fine, but their experience is limited to the world of technology. So I come from a world of regulation, of finance, which are things that they need to understand a bit more about. High-tech companies are finding themselves more and more in the world of regulation. Questions around the so-called net neutrality, for example, or privacy, or the so-called right to be forgotten. These are all places where technology and government regulation are intersecting, maybe even colliding. So I know a lot from my experience about how to think about regulations, how to adjust your company to deal with them. So I think I can bring some of that. The other thing is that Google makes billions of dollars a year that it has to invest in new ideas, and so capital allocation, holding businesses accountable, all of those things are business concepts that I hope I bring to them with my background in finance. And so I think it's going to be a nice mutual learning where I'll learn a lot about Silicon Valley and technology, and they'll learn from someone who's got a different worldview. It's a version of diversification. So that's what I'm bringing.
So it seems like in your examples, there's some lessons for young people or for people anticipating a career change, that you do something like serve on a board at Alphabet for broader reasons, for connected with your feelings for people in various places, and appreciating the kinds of different understandings that we all can.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, frankly, all the business, I think, or the better parts of business are the people sides, both sides. So there's the building your own human capital, as the economists would say, learning more and more and continuing to learn and be a continuous learner as you go through your career. The other side is really understanding what others are going through and figuring out how you can be helpful to them. I describe that as empathy. And I think a good career has a nice mix of both, where you're building your own human capital.
Good for society and for yourself.
And good for others. Yeah. And so I think that's back to where we started. One of the great things about finance is you can be good for society and good for yourself. And that's an important lesson around careers in general. So I'm very excited about both the opportunity at the Alphabet Board, but more importantly, the opportunity to lead TIAA. It's been spectacular because it's had the society benefit while also being things that I'm really fascinated with.
Okay, I want to thank you very much. Again, this was wonderful discussion.
Well, thank you very much. I had a great time doing it. Thank you.
So you started out in business, I understand, selling magazines as a teenager.
Right.
What's different about you? Why did you do that?
Well, I guess I was just curious. I would say it's two sides of a coin. On one side, I'd say I was very curious about how to make some money and had to see the financial freedom as a teenager. Freedom. I was interested in that. On the other hand, I saw, it was not that difficult. It's really trying to organize things.
So later, you founded Hill House Capital Management yourself,
right?
Alone, right?
Uh-huh.
How did you get the courage to do it? Why did you do that?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, I wanted to do something I'm passionate about. I think having sort of apply what I learned in an environment that fits where I want to go is very hard to go for work somebody. So why don't I just work, start a company and focusing on what I believe in back then was to investing in China's emerging technology companies and the businesses. Yeah. So I thought that was my passion. I wanted to do that, and the opportunity opens up. I got one investor.
I just think most young people today wouldn't think of starting. They can't imagine they could do that.
If you never know until you try.
Yeah. So it was you regarded it as a big gamble then, and you didn't know that you could do it.
Oh, I always kind of had the interest and confidence starting something. I tried actually a few other things before this. Some of them failed, some of them succeeded a bit. But in the end, I truly believe you have to be a doer. You can't just be a thinker. You have to get started. Something.
Well, I'm just academics are thinkers.
Yeah, well, you are doing by teaching. That's a different doer system. Yeah.
So you made it into a huge financial advisory company. And you have investors, are they from China exclusively, or are they from other countries as well?
Yeah, around the world, yeah.
Yeah, and so what is your philosophy? Do you follow a formula? Do you use personal judgment?
Very simple. You want to learn the philosophy, come here to School of Management, and also learn from across street at the Yale Endowment. That's where you learn the basics.
My students have started by taking my course online.
Right. That's that's the first step. to listen to your class is a good idea, but really it's about, I think at the end of the day it's about spotting those opportunities, applying common sense. Sometimes, common sense is hard to get by.
Now, a lot of people have the impression that markets are efficient,
right,
and that it's so competitive that you can't win at this game. But somehow you had confidence otherwise. Right. What gave you? Why didn't you believe this efficient market story?
Right. Oh, that was when I was at school here and was taught, right, market efficiency theory, but at the same time, it's a dynamic concept. There were so many conditions and assumptions on that market efficiency.
Right.
And I think, the opportunity I spotted back then about China's investment opportunities was so big, was such a transitional economy that, that over time actually I developed my theory. Initially, I think, I would say, I thought myself as a value investing, as a conventional sense of value investing, which is more about discovering value. What are the value? Maybe that discovering value started from kind of cigarette bet, sort of deep value investing. Over time, I changed. I would say I'm more sort of not only about discovering value, but also about adding value, and also about like investing in value not as a static concept, but a dynamic growth concept. So that's sort of my twist, if you will, on the sort of value investing
But is
philosophy.
your twist related to your personal ability to judge people and business ideas?
Right, yeah. I think about myself not so much an investor in a way. So I think about I'm a kind of entrepreneur who happened to be an investor.
Well, you've been on the other side.
Right. So I was thinking, so that's really every time when I make a judgment, I'm not like going through, to the five forces and, all those static business school case. Instead, I was like, think about me starting that business. What's the essence of that business? What's the nature of that, the people behind the business? What are the drivers of his sort of ambition? What's, and trying to understand better from first principles, not necessarily from a formula. That's how I started.
But still, how did you get started? In a sense, you have to find investors who believe in you from the beginning.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
I was lucky enough. I got convinced David Swenson.
Well, you were that's an interesting story, because you were one of his interns.
Right, that's right.
And in fact, you translated his book into Chinese.
That's right. His book was selling for $30 in the US. After my translation, sells for $5 in China. That was a lot of value added.
So you were telling the world how you were going to do it, and you had, right? So you are following something like the Swenson approach.
Yes, absolutely. I think in the end about that thinking about long-term orientation, but the focus on the equity, focus on the residual free cash flow of the nature of the business, and focusing on risk-adjusted returns. So that's what I learned from David. I mean, those are philosophies still very much the same core philosophy of what we do. But then I would say we combine that with actually a lot of Chinese philosophy. One thing I always talk about the Chinese Buddhism in a way, talking about how do you do when thousands of drops of water, you only need one bottle. So how do you think about that focus? How do you think about there's sort of how do you win a conventional markets using unconventional thinking? That's Taoism thinking. There's also the thinking about, how do you be focused and also have peace of mind, don't get bothered by the market movement. There are a lot of those philosophies, I would say, combined with what I learned here at School of Management and with David Swenson. I would say those are forming the foundation of my investing philosophy.
You've been through some big market movements in China.
Right.
How did that make you feel? The market was going crazy. It must have seemed that way.
Right. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think that's exactly the opportunity, right? So when there's people chasing up and downs, when the volatility drives so much opportunity for long-term investors. So if you're long-term orientation, you should have an inherent advantage over other people. When I was asked actually to speak with the Chinese Fund Manager Association, they were talking about, they're like, Lei, we love what you do about long-term investing, but how do you make money, despite being a long-term investor? But that's the whole point, right? So like you want to be long-term because that's actually how you think you can make money.
But did you sell at the top in 2007?
I wouldn't necessarily know exactly, on like a whole portfolio because we're not market timer. But we look at everything on bottom-up basis. We look at some of them get overvalued and you will sell. Some of them
Yeah.
actually, you hold on to them over a long period of time. You look at our top holdings on the public equity portfolio. We have been there for, I would say, 60, 70% of names that we owned in the first couple of years. And after 10, 11 years, we still own them. And
But you said unconventional.
yeah.
How do you make sure that you're unconventional? How do you know?
Right. I think, a conventional thinking in China is that first you have to do market timing well. You have to do sector rotation. So you always follow the trend because China changed so fast. You can't be a long-term orientation because, that's just because the market changed so fast. Unconventional thinking that, actually we could be a long-term orientation and hold on to very few names, do a concentrated book instead of a very diversified investment portfolio. Those are unconventional.
Oh, no, you weren't as diversified as other
No, I was
firms.
not at all. I was, probably we own, 10, 20 as a core names. Those make them
And
vast
some of them,
majority.
like was it JD?
Well, JD was a private equity portfolio turned into a public equity portfolio, and some of companies like Gree and Media, the air conditioner company we own from the beginning. We own now 11 years, and they are still our top 5 holdings.
Anyway, I wanted to ask you about philanthropy.
Yes.
You are a philanthropist. Yale is very grateful for your gift.
Thank you.
What do you think? Is that something that's important to you in your lives? And are you different from other people in your emphasis? Is it part of your philosophy that does it combine well with other things you do?
I think it's a learning process for me. I think that's really obviously to me, education changed my life. And it's had such a strong touch on what I do on every day. So my wife and I, when we reflect on that, I say, how can other people benefit from our experiences?
Yeah.
And so that's why we set up, school in China for underprivileged kids, of vocational schools. That's why we give scholarship inside China. Now we actually set up the smaller libraries for schools in Southeast Asia and India. And that's why we did what we, did at Yale. So I think the way to make a connection to the people who have similar situations, and at the same time, I think China is in a critical crossroad. Hopefully, there's a lot of first-generation entrepreneurs who made the money. Hopefully, by being an example in doing this, China could change to be, European-style kind of dynastic culture, to be much more about this open culture, so that help with social mobility and help give people more chances. I think China is right now in this critical crossroad.
That's great to hear. You were giving the idea of evolving Chinese culture, and that somehow philanthropy was different in older China, right? There was philanthropy all along.
There were a lot of philanthropy in different ways and throughout the culture, throughout the Chinese civilization.
But maybe it had a qualitatively different, like more emphasizing to one's family or to one's caste.
Yeah, to one's communities, and also obviously to be connected to the sort of the communities, and there always been in the Chinese culture the Confucianism, always the belief of giving, and but I think the recent decades obviously had been very hard for the Chinese because of the economic difficulties. Now, the first generation entrepreneurs are shaping the Chinese culture. I think that by being a role model for people, a lot of people who sort of make the money and to say, okay, there's a better way of using that money and to help the society. And I think that was a very rewarding experience.
So you say it was important for you to visit the United States here at Yale for some years. Is that an enriching experience?
Oh, absolutely. I enjoyed it so much. I learned, not only about the knowledge and the instruments of financial instruments, but also the philosophy, the thinking. That if you combine that with the sort of the Chinese philosophy, I think that makes perfect sense for me to form my investing philosophy as well as my life.
We're trying to, with Coursera, we're trying to give an opportunity for people to see other. Many of our students are from other countries. What do you think about where the social media, the online experience is changing the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that actually in emerging markets, this could have even deeper sort of implications, because essentially you have the opportunity to leapfrog the traditional classroom, and the value added you could have to have world-class faculty, world-class teaching, transcending the current system. And I think that given that most of the younger people in the emerging markets also, many of them now have smartphones that they have access to all those information. If somehow we can empower them, doesn't matter where they live in, suburb of Indonesia or India or China or Brazil, people can benefit from that knowledge dissemination and really empower them to really try something much better for themselves. This would help with the social mobility, help giving people the chance to succeed.
So it sounds like you are talking about diversification into human capital.
Right.
A lot of people have, maybe you'll tell me whether you agree, a lot of people have traditional views about how to invest, and they think of, say, real estate as a sure bet, and they think of taking a finance course as something kind of secondary. But what do you think?
There's nothing better than investing in yourself and investing in education. And education investment over long run always produce the best compounding results that you could never imagine. I think that that's for sure the best investment you could ever make on yourself, on your friends and your relatives, on the society. I have a deep belief in that. I think there's we haven't even talked about externalities, right? Then we have a better educated society, and that interact with each other can produce even more profound impact. I think so we're just at the beginning of the sort of the era that we can see how human capital can be harnessed better. I think there are two things going on. One is about there are two things that we should be mindful of. One is about technology change, artificial intelligence, would that replace human capital now?
Right.
Secondly, about the sort of the knowledge gap or digital gap between different classes, socioeconomic classes of people, especially in places like emerging market where they don't have the same access. For the people in suburb of Jakarta may not have the same access for the people in New Haven. So how do you bridge that gap? Because the digital gap actually got widened. So how do you bridge that gap? And also, how do you think about technology not only, not as a sort of disfranchising factor, and actually as an equalizer to help bring people together. Those are things that are very interesting.
Okay, well, I'm very happy today to have Georgia Levinson-Cohen as speaker for our financial markets class. Thank you for coming. This course I've always thought is different from many other finance courses in that it emphasizes social purpose. Often finance is described as a way to make money. But it doesn't have to be for yourself, or it can be for a broader purpose. In fact, normal humans are not exclusively selfish. So we have here someone whose life exemplifies what I'm trying to get across. Georgia is executive director of the Pershing Square Foundation, which is a family foundation in New York City that has purposes other than maximization of anyone's fortune. She's also connected with the Columbia university program in social enterprise. But what brings her here most directly is her recent book, Capital and the Common Good, which is all about innovative technology in finance. So what is finance about? It's about incentivizing people. It's about managing scarce resources so that they're used effectively. It's about conveying information and making information credible and universal. All those things are a technology. And I think her book is a wonderful example, or a wonderful treatise on how that is done. So I'm going to leave it now to Georgia. And then we'll, at the end, we'll have questions. Leave about, 15 minutes at the end. Okay.
All right, thank you. It's always a treat to come back to Yale and to New Haven. I was an undergraduate. I graduated in 1994 and did a second tour at Yale and New Haven when my husband was on the faculty here at SOM. So both my kids were born here, so lots of neat connections, and I love to come back. Particularly, thank you, Professor Schiller, for having me and for inviting me to be part of this financial markets course. I was thinking as I came up this morning on the train of a conversation we had. I brought the book, actually, last November, so just over a year ago when the book came out. And Professor Schiller very kindly agreed to do sort of a fireside chat with me about the book to say, what do you mean by capital and the common good? What do you mean about innovative finance? And how can we use finance to tackle the world's most urgent problems? And we had scheduled the conversation, and it actually took place, I think, about November 8th or November 9th. So it was right after the election. And I think we were all a little dazed and confused, and we did a pretty good job staying on track on that evening. But indeed, I think it's been in some ways a dazed and confused and a little bit of a bewildering year since then for all of us. And I think therefore all the more reason to think about creatively about how we solve and address some of these tackling problems. And I'll say a few weeks after our fireside chat, Bob Schiller very kindly referenced the book in one of his opinion pieces in the New York Times, where sort of an open letter to Donald Trump and the incoming administration, sort of that we imagine might be a business-friendly and a markets-friendly administration, to say here are some interesting policy ideas that reference finance and reference markets for public good. And I think even the dismal science and the dismal scientists in those days were hopeful. I think we all remain hopeful. But again, it's been an interesting year. And I guess as I came back to campus today, all I could think was how fortunate really all of you are to be spending this year and these years, I think, here at Yale, where you have the chance, I hope, in a very safe and welcoming and open environment to soak in the knowledge, to soak in the training, to soak in the skills, but I think also really buttressed by faculty and friends and mentors like Bob Schiller, who encourage you to take that learning and that knowledge and really think about how it's applied in the public sphere. And I think that's exactly what we're going to discuss today, how finance and what sometimes are really sort of some plain vanilla tools, debt, equity, insurance, et cetera, how we can really think about harnessing these for public purpose. Before we get into too many of the case studies, and I hope the case studies you find interesting, and again, we will save some time at the end for Q&A, but before we really get into some of the definitions and the case studies, I'd like to do a little bit of a thought experiment. So I'm going to ask all of you to think about how you got here this morning and how you got here today. And I don't mean literally. I sort of came back through campus, and I guess my route here would have been from Old Campus or from Branford through Commons and grabbed a muffin or something. I saw that Commons, which I guess is no longer called Commons, was closed. But I guess some of you from the newer colleges also may have had a less of a climb or less of a journey. But so I don't mean literally today. I mean what it took for you to get here, what it took for your families, what it took for your communities to send you here. And all of you today really represent, in many different ways, an investment in our future and a bet on our future. And it's a bet your family's made, it's a bet your parents have made, it's a bet your communities have made, it's a bet your high school's made, it's a bet this university has made, it's a bet that the federal government has made. And the reason I mention that is because you might not think about this, but there are actually a number of very interesting, innovative financial instruments that have helped people make that bet on your future. So what do I mean by that? Well, some of you, your parents or your families may have used 529 accounts to help them and to help you save for college. Now, they may have been putting money into 529s instead of their own 401ks, their own savings for the future. They may have had other savings instruments. They may or may not, depending on where you lived and where you grew up, Some of you may have lived with extended families. Some of your families may have rented. Many of your families actually paid for their homes with mortgages. And what those mortgages really represent are contracts with your future family selves. So mortgages essentially say we are borrowing from our own future to secure an asset. For many of our families, it's the most valuable asset we have. And we can't really pay for the whole thing up front, but we can pay in small bits over time. When you arrived at Yale, you arrived probably pretty healthy. That doesn't just happen. That's because of a lot of pretty inventive health insurance, either that a school provides or your family provides. And when you got here, many of you received financial assistance from the school. For many of you, for most of you, that was sort of very generous grants that no one has to repay. And let's be clear, all students who are at a place like Yale are receiving some kind of financial subsidy because Yale charges tuition still below cost. But for many of you also, it meant publicly subsidized loans, or you had to go to your families had to go to the private markets for loans. And again, that student aid is you borrowing from your own future and your ability to repay in the future for an investment in your human capital today. So your bets on the future, finances helped, no pressure. But I ask all of you as we talk today, and sort of even as you leave this classroom, to say, okay, I'm going to broaden that aperture a bit. And I'm not just going to think about myself, and I'm not just going to think about my family and my immediate community, but are there other ways that I can start to think about some of these financial instruments that we don't actually think about, but they didn't just appear. They were designed by policy specialists. They were designed by financial engineers. Are there ways that we can really think about those to really harness them in ways that help us grapple with some pretty onerous and pretty challenging conditions out there: climate change, health, economic inclusion, and maybe even issues of social justice. So can we think about finance in a ways that help us really sort of work towards a much broader shared prosperity? So briefly, as Professor Schill said, I come today with a few different hats. So I did leave my Y94 hat at home, but one of my other hats are theory and practice. So practice, I've spent most of my career since my Yale undergraduate days in the world of social change and community and economic development, pretty broadly defined, sometimes in the private sector, sometimes in the social sector. Currently, I'm the executive director of the Pershing Square Foundation, which is a foundation that uses both grants and impact investments to address issues of health, education, economic development, social justice. Very happy to save some time at the end to talk to you about both our grant making and our impact investing strategies. But I also teach in the social enterprise program at Columbia Business School and have written a couple of books. One on social entrepreneurship and this one on innovative finance. I came to the idea of innovative finance and of thinking about using financial tools and financial instruments, broadly speaking, to address issues of public good and public purpose, as I was just finishing the previous book, the first book on social entrepreneurship. And this was about fall 2002. I was in New York City, and that first book on social entrepreneurship was really much more about iconic change makers, people like Wendy Kopp, who had founded Teach for America, or Mohammed Yunus, who had won the Nobel in economics for his work in microfinance, or Bill Drayton, who had founded Ashoka. But it was really more about those sort of people we think of these larger-than-life change makers. And I was in New York. It was during Sandy, big hurricane, shut down the city. And I'm a lifelong New Yorker, born and bred. And it was really one of the first times in my lives that I'd seen the city actually come to a complete halt. So the city was really paralyzed in part because the subways and the buses, the mass transportation system, which is really the artery and the lifeblood of the city, was actually shut down. It's an extremely rare occurrence. What was more remarkable actually was how quickly the MTA got the subways and buses running again. And what I subsequently learned was that some of the unsung heroes of Sandy and that natural disaster were actually not these larger-than-life Wendy Kopp folks that you sort of read about and you hear from at conferences, but were really the risk analysts in the bowels of the MTA who discovered that with $5 billion in damage because of the storm to the tracks of the subway, so the subway was flooded, 100-year-old wiring was completely corroded. With that degree of damage, the MTA found itself uninsurable in the traditional insurance markets. And without insurance, it meant that they couldn't get the subways and buses up and running. And what the folks there did was extremely creative and extremely entrepreneurial and extremely innovative. And they said, you know what, we need to be a little bit untraditional about how we think about insurance. And they went to something called the catastrophe bond markets, which is typically used to reinsure insurance companies, had typically been used really to protect and insure private property, not public infrastructure. They went to the catastrophe bond markets and pulled like a municipal finance first. I thought this was very creative and innovative and led me to think, wow, maybe there are other people who are thinking really out of the box about ways to take really sort of age-old and traditional financial instruments and products and apply them to new circumstances. So I started to look at things like vaccine bonds and green bonds, which aren't always all that green, and social impact bonds, which aren't even bonds, and a whole range of financial instruments. And as this started to become a book, people became more excited, and in some ways it took on greater urgency, because at the time, global leaders were beginning to meet at the UN to articulate what would become the Sustainable Development Goals, these sort of 17 very bold, very audacious goals in health, economic development, inclusion, infrastructure, et cetera. And the more that countries began to speak and sort of announce and commit to these goals, the more they realized that actually all the public assistance, all the sort of public spending and development assistance and all the philanthropy in the world would still leave us a couple $1 trillion short of the money and the investments we needed to achieve these goals, and therefore we needed to go to the capital markets and try to crowd in more private sector dollars with things like green bonds, with things like cat bonds. But the more I looked and the more I really thought about it and the more I analyzed, and I can give, well, these are the examples that would get to, the more I realized that actually innovative finance is much more about better money and smarter money than it is just about more money. So it's not just about crowding in more capital, it's smarter capital. And what I mean by that, as what Professor Schiller alluded to, was can we really think about innovative finance as a way to give people the security, the motivation, the incentives they need to take risks or to make longer term decisions, to have long views and long horizons, to invest in prevention, for institutions and governments to invest in really evidence-based policy. And maybe really that's what innovative finance is all about. So a quick word on definitions before I get to some of the examples. I do think, and I sort of want to address head on, the difference between what I would call innovative finance and financial innovation. So if you're taking this class, it signals to me already that you're interested in finance, and you already actually know a fair amount about finance. But as you're also well aware, sort of beyond, within the academy, but also beyond academia, finance is a very political and complicated term in industry and concept. And as I wrote the book, I sort of encountered really two camps. There's one camp that sort of really tends to fetishize finance. And as I talked to friends and colleagues who work in financial services, they said, well, what are you talking about? Isn't all finance for good? I mean, isn't that what finance is? And on the other end of the spectrum, at the other extreme, there are folks who really have come to be very wary and very skeptical, usually justifiably, but sometimes even have a more demonizing view of finance and say, you know what, we're really concerned about the financialization of the economy. And I think what that means is that people are legitimately concerned about privatizing everything, which is different than finance. But they also are very concerned about sort of financial innovation and financial engineering unchecked. So in 2008, in the wake of the financial crisis, for example, Paul Volcker, the former Fed chief, very famously said, the only really useful innovation in finance has been the ATM. After that, we're done. And you can see really what he means by this is that credit default swaps, subprime mortgages, a lot of the fancy engineering that we saw in the lead up to the financial crisis really can sort of get out of control and cause dramatic instability in a system and bring down a system. And so again, for the purposes of this discussion, and when you write the book, you get to define the terms. Financial innovation I tend to think of as sort of engineering that's really strictly designed to improve market efficiency and to increase profits. And that could be things like speed trading or subprime mortgages, maybe even payday lending. I mean, those are really engineering for engineering's sake. Whereas I consider innovative finance So they say, let's get down to the nitty gritty and get the show on the road. And so we're going to do that in with some examples. And again, I'm going to sort of plow through these and then keep some time at the end. I'm happy to sort of talk about these examples, other examples, the work at Pershing, et cetera. So I asked all of you to think about how you got here this morning. I'm going to start with an example that relates a little bit to how I started my morning and how I got here this morning. And my morning started before I got on Metro North. I had to hop in the subway. And no, this is not all a talk about the New York City subway, although it could be. I hopped in the subway and I swiped my Metro card. And as we know, every swipe of the Metro card costs $2.75. So if you're a daily commuter and you're taking 2 of those trips every day, so perhaps up to 500 times a year, $2.75 can add up very quickly. It's very expensive. So fortunately for me and for others, my children have free Metro cards because they're subsidized by the schools, and sort of the seniors have also free or very discounted Metro cards. And I have a monthly Metro card, which means that in aggregate I'm paying a lot less than the equivalent of $2.75 a ride. The problem, and that's good news, the bad news, the not so good news, is that monthly Metro card costs me $121 up front every month. And it turns out that $121 up front every month is cost prohibitive for many New Yorkers, millions of New Yorkers, in fact. So that means that the 75,000 students in the CUNY system, for example, using higher education, the city university, more than half of them live at the poverty line. And because of the way sort of poverty and low-income populations in places like New York are now distributed, most people are not living in the inner city. They're living spread out, which means that there's a commute. That commute becomes very expensive when you can't afford the discounted Metro card. The same thing is true clearly for millions of low-income New Yorkers who need to commute. So it's estimated that in aggregate, New Yorkers are overpaying $500,000 a day because they can't afford the upfront cost. Now, this seems like something that's quite easy to fix, and maybe the MTA should address it. They haven't. So interestingly, there are fintech startups that are sort of social enterprise type startups that have started to address things like this. So one of them, led by a guy named Avi Karnani, is called Alice Financial. And Avi's insight was that given mobile technology and a small float, he is a for-profit, he could basically charge people a little bit more to pay him weekly amounts, so probably about $30 a week rather than the full upfront cost. And his float that he charges, which is very small, allows him, essentially recirculates and allows him to serve more people. Now, this is not just a problem in New York, this is a problem in London, this is a problem in most major cities, and Alice Financial, of course, is a workaround, but it's really solving a major problem with essentially layaway financing, right? Not new, something that we're all familiar with, but he's actually intentionally designing it for good. I came to the Alice Financial example, and I came to this not because I ride the subways a lot and every day, but because when I was writing a book about innovative finance, I could not skip over the M-Pesa revolution in Kenya. So that's a story that if you're writing about the intersection of technology and finance, you start with. And I think most of us know that story. So 2007 or so, Safaricom, the telecom company, comes to Kenya, where maybe 75% of the population doesn't have a phone and is certainly unbanked. Fast forward 10 years, now about 80% of the population in Kenya has a mobile phone, and using the M-Pesa platform, Pesa is Swahili for money, people are also now effectively banked. They have access to the digital payment platform, and they, by some estimates, 40%, 50% of the Kenyan GDP is flowing through the M-Pesa platform. Kenya's and M-Pesa have clearly led the way. Other companies have followed, other countries have followed. We're a little bit of a laggard in the US, but we're catching up. What's interesting to me about the M-Pesa story is that while 80% of Kenyans are effectively now banked in some capacity because of the M-Pesa technology, about that many are also still living off the electrical grid in Kenya. And 2 billion people, by the way, globally, are not on the formal electrical grid. So what does this mean? This means that they are relying on other sources of energy that are often very expensive and noxious, and in some cases toxic. So, for example, people are using single-use lead batteries, or they're using candles, or they're using lanterns, or they're using diesel generators. Often what they're using is kerosene. Kerosene is very expensive, but you can buy it in small quantities to make it a little bit less expensive per use. But over time, it's a huge expenditure. It burns, it poisons, it's a major contributor to global warming through CO2. So all around, kerosene is a really bad source of energy. And of course, if you're a Kenyan household and you're spending more than $200 a year, which most are, on kerosene, you know it makes perfect economic sense to install a solar panel that only costs $199. Again, right, it's the Alice Financial problem, it's the MetroCard problem. Most of those families do not have $199 up front to make the investment. So people know it makes sense. It's not that people are making bad decisions. They just do not have the upfront cash required. Again, enter into the Kenyan market, and now we're seeing a proliferation of these companies like M-Kopa. Kopa means borrow in Swahili. As you will see, Swahili is effectively the lingua franca of innovative finance. And what M-Kopa does is it not only installs a solar panel in your home, but it installs an electronic payment and tracker so that you can make essentially layaway, pay-as-you-go payments for the solar panel in small increments over time. Again, layaway is not new, pay-as-you-go is not new. What's new and what's innovative is the application to alternative and ultimately more affordable energy sources for families who wouldn't otherwise be able to make them. Now, M-Kopa has sort of led, but there are many other companies and countries that are following suit. At Pershing Square, we are invested in a company called Ngaza. We're invested through a fund called the Social Entrepreneurs Fund that makes these kind of investments on our behalf. And because of companies like M-Kopa and Ngaza, adoption rates for solar are estimated to be have accelerated maybe 4 times faster than they would have otherwise. And you can imagine once you start thinking with this lens about sort of pay as you go, that it doesn't just have to be solar. This could be, and we are seeing, for water, for health services. There are books that schools are downloading and paying per chapter. You could really, you begin to explode your mind a little bit about all the goods and services that are now suddenly available when they wouldn't be otherwise because the upfront cost was too high. What I only really sort of recently started to understand is that, in some ways, to me, the most exciting, the most interesting part is that through companies like Ngaza, families for the first time are not only sort of moving out of energy poverty, so they're finding better sources of energy, for the first time they're actually able to establish credit histories because there's documentation of their payment and repayment schedules that shows that they're extremely consistent and shows they're creditworthy. So suddenly they can begin to move up the credit ladder and not just be eligible to finance things like solar. These families don't necessarily own, in fact, they typically don't own their homes. So this credit history in some ways is the most valuable asset that they could possibly own. And you move up the credit ladder and suddenly you are eligible for financing for all types of things, a home, your child's education, et cetera. So again, I think this intersection of technology and sort of new forms of finance that it ushers in is very interesting and has, in some ways, huge and exciting potential. I know the next question is, or at least the question in my mind, this is a very sort of techno-optimistic and kind of techno-utopian view of the world, and aren't these really just about technology and not necessarily about finance, right? I mean, why is this a book? Why isn't it called, innovative technology? And I think that that's a fair question. And as I started to probe further, and as we really think through, I think at the intersection of technology and finance, we pretty quickly run into some limitations. And in some ways, I think, as we think about both the power of finance, but also the bad experience, either the lack of experience or the challenging experiences people, particularly vulnerable people, have had with finance, with financial services. Your experience might have just been that you're with predatory lenders, et cetera. The human interaction and the human component. Professor Schiller and I were talking about this earlier, sort of the need to actually have face-to-face communication with people that you trust. In some ways, we would really quickly bump up against the limitations of what technology and finance alone can do. So I call these cases sort of a good fit, where you have finance, innovation, technology, and trust. So what do I mean by that exactly? What's a good example of a good fit? Thinking about finance and thinking about the underserved, by definition, means that you need to visit and revisit microfinance. And where are we now today with microfinance? So as I alluded to earlier, as I described earlier, Muhammad Yunus, sort of a pioneer of microfinance and microlending in particular, showed in the 1970s, Yunus and others, that you could make very small loans to poor people who, in the absence of collateral, but under the right circumstances, often through joint liability, were able to repay those loans. That was a huge breakthrough in showing credit viability and in launching what would become a commercialized and multi-billion-dollar industry, which is the microfinance industry. In the years since then, people have continued to push the needle on microfinance, what we might call microfinance 2.0, in some ways because there have been real concerns about commercialization and what happens when you introduce for-profit companies into the microfinance space. But in some cases, there have been very legitimate questions and inquiry into how effective microfinance, in particular microlending, so these small loans, have been in actually raising people out of poverty. So many development economists, including some really excellent ones here at Yale and elsewhere, have used very rigorous studies to sort of say, you know what, are those microloans enough? And the empirical record actually is a little bit mixed on this. But I think if you look at some of the meta studies, what we can observe is that lending may be necessary, but not sufficient to raise people out of poverty. And in fact, what people really need are broader access to savings products, to insurance products, to pensions, to some of these payment technologies, that credit alone is not enough. So as I began to explore sort of who are some of the leaders, who are some of the pioneers in this microfinance 2.0, who are some of the organizations globally that have been really successful in developing this broader suite of financial products and services, consistently people said to me, you need to go see IFMR Trust in India. They are lenders to, or they're microfinanciers to the rural poor. They've really done an exceptional job of creating a broad array of products and services, and they're also really thoughtful about technology. So go and talk to IFMR Trust and find out what they're doing. So I went and I spoke with the leaders of IFMR Trust. Parenthetically, most of them are women, and I'll come back to some of the issues related to finance and gender. But I went and spoke to the folks at IFMR Trust, and I said, I understand that you have this incredible array of services. I understand that people can save. I understand that they can use electronic payments. I understand that people get insurance for their cattle or get insurance for their crops. That's really fantastic. How did you get here? And they said, well, we want to tell you how we got here because it's important and it wasn't inevitable. And they said, we want to tell you a story about a client of ours, and we want to tell you what we learned. So they said, we had a client. She was an agricultural worker. She worked in the fields. And she used to come to us regularly for gold loans. So what that means is that she would take her jewelry, very common practice, use it as collateral and borrow against it. Very consistent repair. So she was sort of a terrific type of client. And a few years in, unfortunately also quite common, she's walking to work one day near the field, and she's hit by an oncoming truck and she's killed. And IFMR Trust discovers that she has left behind 5 dependents. So her husband had left her, and she has 2 children that she's supporting, her parents and a sibling. What they realize, of course, is that what's even more tragic is that what she didn't need were gold loans. What she needed was life insurance. That would have benefited her family and really kept them afloat after she was killed. And IFMR Trust had life insurance on their books, so they could have offered this to her if they sort of had a better understanding and insight into who she was and the financial